Chapter 1 of Betty Baird's Ventures. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Holly Jensen. Betty Baird's Ventures by Anna Hamlin Weikel. Published in 1907. Chapter 1 In Tight Papers. Oh, this indigent family of ours! I certainly must bestir myself and do something to support it," said Betty Baird airily to her mother, yet looking determined, and straightening herself up among the cushions piled high on the broad window seat in her room. She emphasized her words by beating a capacious blue sofa pillow, over which the pines scampered in fantastic white lettering, filling the room with the spicy fragrance of the pine needles brought from the campus of the boarding school from which she had just graduated. The airy words and determined manner were both characteristic of Betty, for she did everything with huge enjoyment combined with thorough earnestness. Betty, you alarm me," her mother said, laughing. Your energy is misspent on such a warm day." Betty gave the pillow a final pat, then smoothed it out and stood it behind her straight back. I have always dreamed of doing something, and it makes it more real when I pound a little." From the way Betty said something, you could easily see that had the word been written, it would have had a large capital S and a few flourishes too. What are you thinking of doing? " asked her mother, seriously, yet smiling. Mrs. Baird usually entered into Betty's differing moods. That she could readily do, for she found every mood more engaging and lovable than the last. Betty was silent for a moment, apparently lost in deep consideration of the different pursuits opening before her. She swung her feet lightly, gazing contemplatively at the peeping tips of her white tennis shoes and rumpling her bright hair with a distracted hand. " There is literature," she suggested at length, looking at her mother gravely, and she began to count off on her fingers the various occupations that came to her mind. At the Pines, you know, I was considered good in composition, and my graduating essay — well, you heard how the Bishop himself spoke of that." Betty endeavored to speak meekly, but her brilliantly reminiscent smile was full of gratification. Yes," said her mother, smiling and nodding. " Yet is not 17 somewhat young for authorship? "" In all the range of literature," began Betty grandly, with a comprehensive sweep of her arm and her sweet voice deepening. Then she laughed. " Oh, how grandiloquent ! There is evidently the making of a prig in me." Like most girls of her age, Betty, perhaps, would have taken herself too seriously but for her saving sense of humor. Then, too, at boarding school, she had lived with girls who had not hesitated to destroy openly and ruthlessly her pet conceits and to laugh derisively at her many poetic flights. Very little escaped their wholesome give and take. Mrs. Baird folded the dainty tea towels she had been hemming and leaned back in her low sewing chair. Possibly, Betty, your sense of humor is carrying you too far, and now you are not taking yourself seriously enough. To accomplish anything we must believe in ourselves, in our call, and in our work." Betty opened her eyes wide. This sounded more like her clerical father than her reserved mother. " Now, Carissima, it is my turn to be alarmed. I can't imagine myself with a call. As for my work, it is anything that happens to turn up." " People are happiest, Betty, who have consecutive work, and plenty of it. Your father says you should take things as they come, and of course that is the best plan, but I think you will not be contented long without something definite. I am teaching you to keep house, but with your quickness you will find yourself with a good deal of time on your hands, especially on this Long Island farm where you are a stranger. You do everything with a rush. Here you have finished your 6 towels, and I have still one of mine to hem." Mrs. Baird picked up Betty's little pile of blue and white barred tea towels and scrutinized the stitches. " They are neatly done." " Of course they are," laughed Betty, throwing back her graceful shoulders in burlesque pomposity. Yet under the merry challenge of her sweet, wilful eyes looked confidence in her untried powers. " What can't I do? But I simply hate to sew." Betty finished by making a comic little grimace, though a glimmer of satisfied pride crept into her face at her mother's praise. After all, it is pleasant to do a thing well and to be told so. " You have a great capacity for love or hate, Betty, child, judging from the number of things you hourly hate and love," said Mrs. Baird. " But I am not through my lecture. At Weston you had so many friends that you could easily fritter away half of your time. Now you are old enough to appreciate that time is a gift and that you are responsible for it. You know my favorite Robertson speaks of that strange, solemn thing, time." " Time does n't seem that way to me," gasped Betty. " It is on butterfly wings, flying swiftly, but oh, so beautifully and gayly, too." Mrs. Baird smiled at the amusement she felt at her own inopportune quotation. " I see, Betty, that my sentiment is at least 20 years too old for you," she said, resuming her hemming. Betty stared over the bay with unseeing eyes. " Mother." " Yes, Betty." Betty turned a pair of dark, perplexed eyes to her mother. " Is a man bankrupt when he 's in tight papers? " Mrs. Baird looked up with some surprise. Then she smiled. " No, it is not so bad as that, child. It is only an uncomfortable tightness between resources and liabilities. You have heard your father say that, doubtless. It is his favorite expression for lack of money." " Yes, father said he was in tight papers when I asked him to let me visit Lois next week." Betty sighed dolefully over the missed delight of a visit to her old Pine schoolmate, Lois Baird. Mrs. Baird puckered her brows solicitously. " I am afraid you are very much disappointed, Betty." " Disappointed? Oh, dear, no," exclaimed Betty, and she jumped from the window seat and threw her arms round her mother. " You know I am not anxious to run off from you after being away for 3 years at school. I was to stay with Lois only a week, anyway, for they are going as usual to Capri." Betty sank on the floor by her mother's chair and, leaning cozily against her knee, talked on. " When I asked father about going, he said he was in tight papers and had a mortgage, and that we had to be very economical until this place was paid for. Of course his salary with the Home Mission Board is larger than the one he had at the church in Weston, but his expenses have increased, and this buying a house takes a great deal of money. I forget how much, but it seemed a lot, and I made up my mind to help. Father sighed terribly when he got through talking. You have Katie to cook for you, and I could do something to make money, I am sure. What to do is the question." " You are rather young," began her mother. " Don't you say that," Betty interposed with mock sternness. " 17 doesn't seem young to me. After all, it 's only one's point of view, as Miss Greene used to say." Mrs. Baird folded her last towel and put it with Betty's. Betty sprang to her feet. " Now you are through with your stint, mother, I 'll walk down by the water, and perhaps I 'll get inspiration there." And humming, " Fair sails over us swinging, lightly the breezes blow," interspersed with whistles in imitation of the catbird, she hurried down the box bordered path to the wide gate that opened almost directly on the pebbly beach. She stood a moment there, and her eyes swept the water from hilly shore to hilly shore, with an interest born of novelty. Far off towards the Sound she could catch a glimpse of the yellow sand dunes, and outlining the glittering heaps, a sky as blue as any in her dreams of Italy. The hills and shore were a vivid green. Clumps of cedars clung tenaciously to the hills that man was disfiguring through his merchandising spirit. It was wonderfully beautiful, wonderfully brilliant and inspiring, but how unlike her Pennsylvania mountains among which she had been reared. After their grandeur, the hills of the north shore of Long Island looked almost absurdly pretentious. Yet she was already feeling the secret charm of water and the alluring mystery of fog and mist. Betty loved this hour of the day, when the boats were coming in from their day's journey, the graceful yachts threading their way to their anchorages up the harbor, the coal schooners which loomed ominously around the point like gigantic gray water birds of prehistoric ages, the fisherman with his characteristic short oar stroke, the clamor sculling his flat-bottomed skiff, all alike hurrying to their different havens as fast as wind and tide and oar could carry them. A spell lay on the world. Each piece of the day's work was swiftly and surely finding its place in the plan of the universe. It was not man, but some guiding, powerful hand that seemed, at that early twilight hour, to be fashioning and completing man's ways and destinies, not boats and sailors and trees and winding shore, but gods and creative elements and mysterious workings in the unseen workshop of destiny. The silent returning of boats. There was no hallooing or laughter, but the quiet coming to shore as if the soft south wind had carried away from mortal ears any words spoken in the falling shadows. Betty walked slowly along the shore, then threw herself down on the grassy margin of the path close to the fence of their cornfield. Her winsome young face was very grave as she looked up at the changing sky or watched this noiseless activity of the water life. Suddenly her thoughts were arrested by a familiar sound, the clear whistle of Bob White. Her face lit up as she turned quickly towards a low white fence that ran along the field and looked lovingly for the little brown figure. There he was on the fence post, calling tenderly his covey call. How trim and alert he was, yet something melancholy mingled with his wholesome, cheerful note. Betty felt a strange sympathy for the brave fellow as he flew from post to post, giving out his evening call. She could imitate his whistle perfectly, but would she frighten him away? She gave a low whistle. No, he was not frightened. He answered, "Bob White." She whistled back, "Bob White, Bob White." A great homesickness for the mountains of her native state crept over her while she listened. Oh, Bob White! She could almost see those somber mountains, strong yet tender, softened by their veil of evening mist. How often in the spring she had listened to Bob White, singing from the foot of the Blue Ridge. The water lapped gently at her feet, and she hated it, for oh, how in the stirrings of her memory the mountains loomed in the twilight. She could again feel their quiet and strength, as of standing armies, that had always filled her heart when she looked up at them from her window before falling asleep. They had been a very part of her childhood. She had climbed their rocky steeps by paths rugged and crooked, and so interminable that they seemed, to her childish fancy, to lead straight to heaven, for heaven was just behind the farthest golden cloud. She had played and picnicked among them, and had gone berrying and wildflower gathering, hunting for the wild grape, the blackberry, for the goldenrod and purple asters, for the earliest arbutus and the wintergreen. She could not remember a day when she had not felt they were there, eternally vigilant, sternly guarding, but loving. What did this water creeping at her feet care for her? It was not like her mountains. She buried her face in her hands and burst into a passion of tears. Betty was suffering a homesickness for her mountains and all they represented, her childhood's home, the dear familiar people and ways and sights, as acute as the wanderer's for his native land. Her affections, always strong and tender, clung with a firmness not common with a girl of 17 to the village of Weston nestling at the foot of the Blue Ridge. It was bred into the bone. Gradually the sobs ceased, and Betty, drying her eyes, stood up to look for Bob White, but his wandering flock had heard his call, and in the deepening shadows had hastened with him to their nest. A wave of disappointment swept over Betty when she found herself deserted by her old friend Bob White. She had carried on many a conversation with him in the days when she had learned to imitate almost every bird in the neighborhood. Bob White had always been her favorite. During the hard winters she had scattered grain for her pets, and one of the duties of the Order of the Cup, a society she had organized in Weston, had been to enlist farmers in feeding the birds through severe seasons. She now decided to begin work in their interest as soon as she became acquainted in the village, for she knew how easily a snowy winter could exterminate the delightful homely bird who protected the fields and gave interest to the loveliest landscape. Betty felt better. She always did when she could translate feeling into doing. She became almost reconciled to her new surroundings, and she hurried home developing this plan in her active brain. At dinner Betty was unusually silent, for her father seemed to her too tired to listen to this scheme for Bob White. She suspected that her numberless projects and impetuous energy were a little wearing to the placid scholar. His worn face renewed her afternoon's determination to help in the financial crisis. She ran upstairs to write letters, one to the dearest and truest of schoolmates, Lois Baird of Baltimore, and to compose a short article for the village paper on the subject of her birds. Dr. and Mrs. Baird sat on the broad porch facing the water, talking over the day. "Elizabeth seemed very quiet at dinner," said the doctor. "Is she well?" "Yes, Betty is always well, but I think she will be a little lonely here without any of her young friends," answered her mother. "Craig Ellsworth is the only young person she knows." "Isn't she kept busy helping you?" "Katie is very competent, and with only 3 in our family there is hardly enough work to go round," replied Mrs. Baird. "I am very desirous of having Elizabeth grow into a good housewife," said the doctor, stroking his beard meditatively. "She has always been skillful in the kitchen, and she learns quickly, but I think with her housekeeping she should have something else. Young people need variety." "I deprecate this restlessness of the age," said Dr. Baird, shaking his head disapprovingly. "Elizabeth is not dissatisfied, even if she is restless. She is joy personified. All growing things are constantly moving. Though she is impetuous, she is not blundering. She never potters over her work, and she accomplishes a vast amount without appearing to work at all." "I want her to be like her mother," said Dr. Baird, smiling, and taking his wife's pretty soft hand in his own. "Exactly like her mother, to suit me." Mrs. Baird smiled back, but shook her head. "No, no. I think that in many respects my education was a mistake, even for my generation, and assuredly it would be for Betty's. It was not general enough. A variety of interests gives proportion, health, and preserves equilibrium." "It trained you for your life, and that is about our only test," suggested her husband. Mrs. Baird remained silent. She was thinking of her constitutional shyness that had been fostered by her secluded girlhood, until even now she suffered when she met strangers, that outside of her home she wholly lacked initiative, and that if it had been necessary for her to earn her own living, it would have been impossible. How the gymnasium, boating, swimming, and skating, or the organization of an altruistic society like Betty's Order of the Cup, would have helped her to overcome her inherited feebleness of nerve, and made facing the world easier and even pleasant. She rejoiced to see Betty wholesome, fearless, active, even when the initiative was half willful, sanguine, and lacking in self-consciousness. She broke the silence by saying, "I have thought a great deal about this question since she has been away. This is the memory season for our Betty. A joyous girlhood is a memory that will sweeten many a hard after year." She was silent for a moment, then added with a sigh, "After all, how little we can do to save her from mistakes. However, I shall try to keep one step ahead of her in all her experiences." "Yes," answered Dr. Baird, "and I like your idea of making this a beautiful memory season for Betty, making nests of pleasant thoughts, as Ruskin puts it. What do you think she could combine with her home duties?" Mrs. Baird hesitated to broach Betty's latest plan. She knew her husband's love and reverence for great literature, and his impatience with anything that fell short of his ideal. What would he say if Betty, at 17, should try to write for publication? She is now thinking of literature, she hazarded. Literature? She thinks that perhaps she has a gift for writing. A gift for writing what? Asked Dr. Baird perturbedly, but to the point. I hardly know. I doubt if she does herself. What has started the child on this? He asked, smiling in spite of his dismay, and polishing his glasses vigorously. You remember that her compositions were much admired. Poor child, interposed the doctor. You won't discourage her? Mrs. Baird asked somewhat anxiously. Elizabeth is not easily discouraged, said Dr. Baird with pride. Anyway, it will be good training for her in English. In writing, as in everything else, one must serve an apprenticeship. But of course, she won't have anything accepted. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 2 of Betty Baird's Ventures by Anna Hamlin Weikel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 2. My Mother's Cookery Journal. Betty could not forget that her father was in tight papers. She was constantly revolving in her mind schemes for his relief. But what could a girl of 17 do? A boarding school education was not a particularly good preparation for teaching. Moreover, she had quietly ascertained that there were no vacancies in the village school, and she knew she could not leave home to teach elsewhere. She carefully went over all the opportunities offered by the village, but could not hit on a feasible plan. Literature beckoned her. After the talk with her mother, she spent several days in her room, looking over the literary productions that had received the highest marks at the Pines. Betty's room was very pretty, and she had a knack for making it not only immaculately clean, but bright and attractive. A long recessed window, with cushioned seat, overlooked the bay, while a side window towards the west opened into a quaint old garden. Besides the white bed, the low dressing table, and the chest of drawers of bird's eye maple, a series of bookshelves stood in a shallow alcove filled with a queer but beloved assortment of books, old and new, the shabby old ones with childish dog's ears and their pictures kissed into blurs, the new ones still gay with spotless covers and maidenly bookmarks. Above her writing desk hung a picture that represented an epoch. Her class with their graduating gowns billowing around them, and in each gloved right hand a diploma. A Russian samovar, a pair of tall brass candlesticks, and a green vase filled with sweet peas topped the bookshelves with a background of photographs of her schoolmates. Then there was her table, at which she did her serious writing, drawn close to the window. It was heaped with papers, and had a literary look, she said. A blue and white school flag hung loyally next to her father's college emblem over the doorway, and souvenirs of the Pines, pillows, pictures, and books were on every hand. On this June afternoon, a late number of the Atlantic Monthly lay on the window seat. Father thinks highly of this, she said half aloud. She took it up and settled down on the cushions. He says it is so literary. I shall look it over and see just what they publish, and get an idea of what I ought to send. Though if it is so literary, I suppose one of my essays on — let me see. She threw down the magazine and crossed to her desk. She pulled out first one drawer, then another, and selected several bundles of her school essays, each tied with a blue and white ribbon. As she sat on the floor going over her papers, the sun, flaring in the window for a moment before sinking behind the hill, fell on her hair, transmuting it into spirals of gold. The broad, smooth white forehead was slightly puckered as she studied conscientiously the availability of her material for the Atlantic. The strong, finely curved chin, with its crown of red, tender lips, rested on one knee while she leaned forward, eagerly sorting out the different styles of essays. Twilight, she said aloud, tapping a folded paper meditatively. That sounds literary enough even for the Atlantic. Her face brightened as she read it. Oh, this is good. She sprang to her feet and ran to the head of the stairs, strewing her path with manuscripts. Mother," she called, and flew down the steps. "Won't you come right up, please? I am so excited. I have found the very thing for the Atlantic." Mrs. Baird soon found herself ensconced in the window seat with Betty. "You know, father is always saying the Atlantic is very literary," began Betty, breathless from her good fortune. "I don't know much about it, but it has a great many essays. I learned that at the Pines in my literature class. Holmes and Lowell wrote for it in its early days. Those are the very words in our book. No, Lowell was its editor. Anyway, how does this essay of mine strike you? Miss Greene said it was excellent. See 'excellent' written on it? That shows. Day soon took on the pallid, transparent curtain of twilight. That's the way it really seemed, mother, until night, solemn and stately, came forth in all her splendor of star and high-hung moon." Betty sighed when she finished. It was the last sentence in a long rhapsody on twilight. "It sounds so good I am afraid I stole it from some one." "They say people always feel that way when they write," Mrs. Baird reassured her daughter. She was not troubled on that score. Her trouble was of a different nature. "It doesn't seem possible to write anything so good now," said Betty, who was rereading parts of it with evident enjoyment. "I remember exactly how I wrote it. I was perfectly, perfectly oblivious to every one around me. I didn't feel as if I were doing it at all. Our literature teacher said that is the way all the best writers write. George Eliot and all those master minds." "I am glad to see you in such good company, child," said her mother in kindly banter. Betty saw the point, of course, and had a good laugh at her own expense. "Now you know, mother, I didn't mean that. I shall copy this essay in a bold, clear hand and send it right off, under my own name, too. Lois will be surprised to see it. Her father takes the Atlantic. It will take 4 stamps each way, 16 cents. I shall have to earn some stamps if this comes back too many times. They say they are returned quite often. Well, I may have better luck. You can never tell. Miss Perry has never had one returned." Betty went to her table and stamped and directed 2 large envelopes, then copied and recopied the excellent essay on Twilight, and finally mailed it to the editor of the Atlantic. "How many mails are there from New York to Hobart Bay?" she asked, going into her father's study on the evening of the momentous day. "2," replied her father, deep in a long row of statistics concerning home missions. "Only 2?" she repeated dejectedly, and she walked out. Betty was determined not to depend on one literary effort. She went to the little public library that adorned the principal street of the village, resolved to read the magazines diligently. The librarian was Miss Hunt, a pretty, gentle, brown-eyed maiden lady of 50. "I should like," faltered Betty, and her face grew warm and red, "to know more about the different magazines, for I am going to try to write for them." Miss Hunt looked up with an incredulous gleam in her kind eyes. "Why, how interesting!" she exclaimed politely. "I suppose you think, as mother does, that it is presumptuous for me to try it, but I want to do something, and this is eminently ladylike." Betty laughed, and Miss Hunt echoed her in a faint yet friendly way. She was attracted to this tall, slim, fresh-faced, winsome girl, brimming over with interest in life. Though she had seen her only a half-dozen times, she had begun to have a strong liking for her. Then, too, Miss Hunt had been for many years absorbed in home missions, and was naturally drawn to a daughter of one of the home secretaries of her own denomination. She had, the dear lady, a strong bias amounting to a passion for the subject, and in time Betty was to discover that all roads of conversation somehow led to the mission field. "By the way, Miss Baird, there are 2 young ladies in the village who are home from college, whom I should be pleased to introduce to you," said Miss Hunt, feeling this to be a safer topic than the one Betty had in mind. "Thank you, Miss Hunt," answered Betty, a little absently. Her glance fell on the magazine she held, and her thoughts flew back to the absorbing problem. I shall be very busy, but after I have made a start I shall have more time to make acquaintances." Miss Hunt looked at her admiringly. She remembered a time when she too had written poems and love stories, but she had not had the courage to read them over, even to herself, save in the privacy of her own room. They were yellow as autumn leaves as they lay in her little trunk in the attic, with a package of letters 30 years old. And here stood this beautiful, dark-eyed girl talking of writing as confidently as she had once talked over a new tatting design. How different girls were now, going to college and writing unblushingly for publication. The clock in the village struck 4. " The library closes in an hour? " asked Betty. " An hour and a half." " I must find something to read," said Betty, turning towards the table where the monthly magazines lay. " Harper's is my favorite magazine," said Miss Hunt, handing her a copy. " It is full of sad stories." " I love sad stories," cried Betty joyfully. She took the magazine and began reading. More than an hour passed, and Betty, engrossed, read on. As she turned a page, Miss Hunt interrupted her, saying that the closing hour had arrived. " How do you like the magazine? " she asked, while picking up and assorting the books on the large desk. " It does n't seem my style at all. It 's a magazine for married people, is n't it? There 's a great deal about children, too. I can, though, remember some of my childhood feelings, and I might write them up in the form of a story." " Try it," Miss Hunt advised her. Betty's pony cart was at the door, and together they went to Miss Hunt's home. Then Betty drove thoughtfully to the farm, which she had called Boxwood on account of the evergreen that outlined the beds of geometrical design and bordered the path from the wide gate, ending in 2 huge clumps at the entrance of the house. She found her mother in the garden, training rose vines and pottering around as she called her daily visit to her flowers. " I think I 'll try Harper's next. It 's Miss Hunt's favorite," Betty announced. She kissed her mother and, fanning herself with her hat, sank down on the garden seat under a cedar tree that spread its branches over a poppy bed. " Would it not be wiser to begin with a less well known magazine? " counseled her mother. " Too low they build who build beneath the stars," Betty answered blithely, with one of her old time quotations. " However, while the editor of The Atlantic is deciding on the merits of my essay, I believe that I 'll try My Mother's Cookery Journal. There are whole columns about home affairs, cooking, laundering, household decoration, gardens, etc., 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 as the advertisements say so promisingly." " Now that is an excellent plan," said her mother approvingly. " You can begin by sending half a dozen of Katie's recipes." " Oh, mother, then it would be Katie's literature," wailed Betty, half laughing, but not at all pleased with the practical suggestion. " It would bring you in the stamps you need." " I hate stamps." Betty's bad humor passed quickly while they walked from flower to flower, picking off the dead leaves, training recalcitrant boughs, and rearranging wind-tossed vines and shrubs that had played too violently in the swift south breeze of the early morning. " Miss Spice is at the college settlement this month, mother," Betty said presently, burying her face in a bunch of white roses. " I wonder if she would n't like some of these flowers for her sick people." " I am sure she would," said Mrs. Baird, with a glad ring in her voice. " I was thinking it a great pity that more people could not enjoy this abundance." " I 'll begin picking them at once," cried Betty, clapping her hands enthusiastically. " Father can take them into town to her." " We can hardly ask your father to do it when his time and strength are so valuable. Moreover, Mr. Ellsworth told me some time ago that the express companies would carry flowers to missions and settlements free of charge." " Oh, is n't that perfectly splendid ! Think how clusters of white roses and honeysuckle will look in those rickety, ramshackle rooms," said Betty, holding off at arm's length a bouquet for the dining room table. It was an old fashioned, fragrant garden. Betty had even found among its treasures the sweet scented shrub, and had crushed the spicy purple flower in her handkerchief, and when doing so had felt that she had one of the romantic privileges of her grandmother. Under a scraggly cedar tree was a great bed of brilliant red poppies of translucent texture and daring color, and against its lichened trunk stood a bench built years before. With the urn-capped fence posts for a background and the lean cedar stretching above it, the seat had a picturesqueness that Betty was quick to appreciate. She spent many delightful moments there, looking down into the scarlet poppy cups that waited as if for the incense of her praise. "Now I have it, mother," cried Betty, jumping up from the seat where she had thrown herself to arrange a lapful of flowers, and dancing about delightedly. "I'll get my camera and take a picture of this corner and call it, let me see, 'A Nook in My Garden.' Don't you think that is a splendid idea, Carissima?" Scarcely waiting for her mother's congratulations on her inspiration, Betty dashed from point to point to find the best view for the picture, her mother following more slowly. They finally decided on one which would include 3 of the colonial fence posts. "I might have a copy of my mother's cookery journal on the seat," laughed Betty, who was in high spirits over the new venture. She ran to her room for the camera. The focusing was a matter of the greatest importance. The camera had to be turned this way and that. The legs of the tripod had to be lengthened, then shortened. Now the whole affair was picked up bodily and moved back several feet. Again it was placed as many feet in front of its original position. At last all was arranged to Betty's satisfaction. She stood back, the rubber bulb in her right hand, ready to take the picture. Forgetting in her excitement that her mother was not to be in the picture at all, she raised her left hand warningly. "Now, mother, please don't move until I tell you," she pleaded, and snap went the shutter, and it was done. "Betty, oh, Betty," her mother cried out, "I don't want to be in my mother's cookery journal." "Oh, mother, mother," shrieked Betty, hugging herself joyfully. "Was there ever anything so funny? I was thinking it was you instead of the poppies that I was to take. Now we'll try our luck with another film. Will the lady please step out?" The second film was quickly rolled into place, and a second picture and a third were taken, for Betty would not risk failure. As the house was large, Betty had been able to fit up a darkroom on the second floor, and she now flew up to that place of mystery and suspense. How her heart beat when she saw the delightful nook materialize and come out in all its lights and shadows, a real photograph. The joy of this was never lost to Betty through repetition. Each new picture was a distinct surprise. Betty hunted up facts, not always a pleasant task to a girl with imagination, about poppies, where and how to plant them, and the amount of water and sunshine they needed, ending her article with a line of original poetry. The very next day Betty began to haunt the post office. That it was convincingly proven that there were only 2 daily mails had nothing to do with the matter. Half a dozen times a day she found herself drawn by some invisible lodestone to the tiny square window to ask for the Baird mail. Fortunately, the postmaster included in his activities the dispensing of groceries, and Betty began to deal with him as an excuse for her frequent visits. At last she was rewarded. "Oh, mother, father, see!" she cried, rushing into the study where they were sitting, waving, as if it were a flag of victory, a veritable check. "Why, where did it come from?" asked her mother in surprise, stretching out her hand for it. "Listen, all ye people. Enclosed, please find a check for $1.25 for your article on A Nook in My Garden to appear in a future number of My Mother's Cookery Journal. Now what do you say to that?" she demanded triumphantly. "Good!" exclaimed her father, kissing her. She stooped over his shoulder to get another look at the marvelous thing, while he too gazed as if fascinated at this evidence that his little daughter had really written something that would see the light of print. The strip of blue paper made Betty feel that she could do anything. The $1.25 was an elixir of inspiration and hope. "I must hurry right up to my room and write something else. I have a splendid new idea," she said, tenderly taking the wonderful check from her father. What are you going to do with it? " he asked, with a twinkle in his serious eyes. I have n't quite decided." Betty meditated. " I think I 'll save it for Christmas." Be sure you put it under your pillow to night," her father warned her, and he smiled pleasantly at his little joke, while Betty feigned wrath and flung herself out of the room, but began singing at the top of her voice before the door was fairly closed. Chapter 3 of Betty Baird's Ventures by Anna Hamlin Weikel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3 Merrylegs. The next morning Betty was up bright and early to have a plunge with her father before he went to the city. The tide was high about 6 o'clock, and after swimming and floating half an hour, they sat down with Mrs. Baird to a breakfast with strawberries from their own garden and cream from their own cow, items that added spice and contentment to a meal that even otherwise would have been abundantly satisfactory. " This is a very attractive table," said Dr. Baird, leaning over to smell the clove pinks Betty had put in the center. He added, smiling, " It reconciles one to these commuters' early breakfasts." Betty drove her father to the station, about 2 miles distant, stopping in the village on her way back to do the day's marketing. The long street was filled with handsome equipages. Betty had met no one in Hobart except the librarian, Miss Hunt, and of course the Ellsworths, who were neighbors. Consequently, she was new to the inquisitive little village, and more than one person, looking after her, was impelled to ask who she was. Her plain white linen dress, with a dainty flowing tie, and the white college hat of felt from which a red quill inclined saucily, were very smart and becoming. The lithe, athletic figure, almost boyish in its freedom from fuss and feathers, yet round and girlish, showed in every movement and buoyant step her keen zest in the happy summer life around her. Betty filled her cart with parcels. Then, after unhitching sturdy Merrylegs and patting him for a moment, she placed one foot on the step and was about to get into the cart when an automobile puffed by, honking warningly. Merrylegs shied violently at the sound, and Betty was thrown over on the seat, while the tiny animal ran for dear life. At first Betty could do nothing but hold on, to keep from being thrown out. The frightened steed ran some distance, but was finally brought to a standstill by a powerfully built young man, who sprang out from the sidewalk and literally took the charming little animal into his arms as he would a football antagonist. Betty hastily regained the seat and reached out for the reins. With a low bow and a merry twinkle in a pair of candid blue eyes that shone from his tanned face like brilliant and kindly turquoise, the handsome youth handed them to her. " Oh, thank you," said Betty, adjusting her hat and straightening the lines. " I hope you were not mortally injured by my vicious steed." Her dark eyes smiled mischievously when she noted the 6 feet 2 inches and the broad shoulders of her rescuer. She could not help laughing. It was funny to see that big boy and her mite of a pony. Keeping his muscular hand on the frisky animal so that Betty could not drive off, while a daring light came into his preternaturally grave countenance, he said, " Do you think it's quite safe for you to drive alone? "" I shall run the fearful risk," answered Betty, sober as a judge. " I think I shall follow you in my car, for your steed is evidently very fiery." " Pray do not give yourself any anxiety," answered Betty, without a smile, though her eyes laughed. " If you would be so kind, I should like your name, so I can propose you as a candidate for a life-saving medal." " Thank you, but I prefer to remain a hero in humble life," the young man answered with equal gravity. " You are too modest," urged Betty, politely. " It was only a situation I saved, not a life. In a second your hat would have been in the road." " I am under deep obligations." I could face death, but not ridicule. Thank you again." Betty flicked Merrylegs with the lines, and he trotted sedately down the street. All the way home Betty laughed over the episode. "Oh, Mother," she cried, and she leaped out of the cart and ran into the flower garden. "The funniest thing I ever saw happened this very morning in the village." "Stop laughing, Betty, and tell me about it," said her mother, yet yielding to the contagion of her laughter. Betty rapidly recounted every detail of her adventure. "I am afraid you did not thank the boy properly," said Mrs. Baird. "Why, Mother, how could I look on him except as a melodramatic hero when he literally towered over poor little Merrylegs? For a moment I thought he would just pick him up and spank him. Merrylegs was gritty, though." "I should like to know him," said her mother. "One should be grateful for a kindness, even if it is not performed at the risk of one's neck." Betty, glancing up at her, felt that it would be wise to hurry away, for when her mother's mouth had that little pucker it meant that she was not wholly satisfied with her daughter. "Well, I think I'll go upstairs," she said. "Sit down, Betty," said her mother, looking at her with troubled eyes. "Now, Carissima, what have I done?" asked Betty cajolingly, smoothing her mother's hair caressingly. "Don't you think, Betty, that you were somewhat easy in your conversation with that strange lad?" asked Mrs. Baird. Betty's cheeks flamed. She shook her head negatively and stood up. Her mother put out a detaining hand. "I think that a few simple words of gratitude would have been better." "I didn't have any gratitude," said Betty impatiently. "It was all a humbug," and she ran up to her room and slammed the door in a way that was not to be mistaken. She threw herself on the bed and cried luxuriously. The runaway had been more than the funny scene she had thought it, and the excitement had upset her. The world grew very dark and unjust to poor Betty. "Mother always said I should not be self-conscious with boys, but treat them as I did girls. And now she is scolding me because I did that very thing. If it had been a girl we would have laughed together over the ridiculousness of it all, and I should have invited her to come home with me in my cart." Betty did not find her argument wholly convincing. She knew that the fun of the situation had appealed to her so strongly that she could not resist prolonging it. Yes, she had missed the merrymaking of the Pines, and this was the first opportunity she had had to give and take since coming home. With a blush, she owned that she had acted more like a girl of 14 than one who had passed through the dignifying process of graduating. She sat up on the edge of the bed, very red and very cross. "Well, it's horrid," she decided. She didn't know with whom to be crossest, whether with the guiltless lad, the pony, or perhaps with Betty Baird. "Yes, it's horrid to be grown up," she repeated aloud. She bathed her face and rubbed it so vigorously that she came out of the process as red as a rose. "Oh, Mother, please forgive me," she cried contritely, running to where Mrs. Baird still sat. "I am so unhappy I don't know what to do. I hate to be grown up. I hate scolding. I hate with an awful hatred that horrid boy. But I do love you." "It is hard to know when we are grown up. Everything else came to you easily and naturally. I hoped that would too." "Well, it doesn't. There is nothing I hate as much as young ladyfiedness." "You are upset by the excitement of the morning. You must not worry any more about it. Don't think how you act, Betty." "I was impudent to you and it hurts me." Her mother put her hand over Betty's mouth. "Now let us walk," she proposed. "Come, that's a good thing," cried Betty, quoting from her Alice in Wonderland and dragging her mother up. "Good. This is a vain and unprofitable conversation on such a morning." And laughing, she skipped her mother down to the gate, swinging her hand back and forth. Mrs. Baird begged off. "I am all out of breath, Betty." "It's good for you. I am getting even, too," said Betty gaily, and like two happy schoolgirls they walked arm in arm up and down the shore. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 4 of Betty Baird's Ventures by Anna Hamlin Weikel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 4, The Clamor Boy. Boxwood. Dearest Lois, do you ever see My Mother's Cookery Journal in Capri? They have accepted, think of it, an article I wrote about our poppy bed. I sent a picture of it, too, and named it A Nook in Our Garden. When it is published, I shall send you a copy. It is very exciting to write things and have them accepted. I have sent my essay on Twilight, you remember the one I got excellent for, to the Atlantic Monthly. I have not yet heard from them. I suppose they have more manuscripts to read than My Mother's Cookery Journal. When I showed Father my acceptance, he said we must begin at the foot of the ladder. He does not seem very hopeful about the Atlantic. It is perfectly lovely to endorse checks. Father told me just where to write my name. I never can remember, and I think it had an accustomed look. I dashed my name right off and held my breath for fear of making a blot. You know, we girls at the Pines decided that was the only way to write stylishly. Too much care gave a crude look, also lacked character. I may have to get a typewriter. They say, at least Miss Hunt, the librarian here, says, that typewritten articles receive closer attention than written ones. I don't think that is fair, do you? Then think what terrible mistakes the editors might make because many geniuses are very poor and couldn't afford to buy one. Our place is perfectly lovely just now, but it is awfully lonesome without the girls in the mountains. Last night I cried and cried. I missed our grand old Blue Ridge so. But it is simply grand to be home with Father and Mother, and I have a great deal to do. Mother is making a housekeeper of me. Now don't laugh. I met that boy who saved my life. He is at Harvard, as I suspected. You can't fool a Pines girl in such matters. Miss Hunt introduced us. I told you all about his appearance in my last letter, though Mother says she can't imagine how I saw so much and drew so many conclusions in a minute's encounter and in such embarrassing circumstances. But I did. He is what Jess would call distingué. He is on the football team. He hopes great things for Harvard next year. Then he is on the crew. He has a yacht and an automobile, rides horseback too. There is such a nice boy next door, half a mile away, who is clamming. I know him pretty well. I wish girls could clam. I think it pays better than literature. He makes $11.28 on a barrel, and every week he sends a barrel to New York on the steamboat. He is trying to make enough money to go to college. I shall teach him Latin this summer. He's 18. He has a little sister 3 years old, a regular fairy. I call her Dot because she's so weenty, the cutest mite. We are in rather tight papers this summer, so I want to make money. We are buying this beautiful place. I told you in my last letter I'd describe our new house, and it isn't new either, for Father said it was built 100 years ago. I won't go into details, for the human interest in my letters takes all the room. The house is large for 3 people. It has white shingles, the nice broad kind, and there is a porch or portico running across the front with white pillars. Doric, Corinthian, Ionic? Anyway, they are fluted and very graceful. It is the kind of house the people are building new. Query, could they build them old? Writing for publication makes one very critical. Oh, where was I? Our bay is glorious, and then the garden is full of old-fashioned bushes and flowers. The Japanese quince was blooming when I came home, and orange-tipped orioles were flying around. I suppose the gay colors attracted them. I have named the place Boxwood. How does it sound? I must stop now, for it is growing dark, and the birds are going to sleep. Every evening we have a regular choir of them. Long Island is noted for its great number of birds. One bird is singing alone now. Dear little piping thing, I can barely hear it, growing sleepier and sleepier. You'll be getting sleepier and sleepier too if I ramble on much longer, so good night, my dearest chum. Your devoted Betty. Betty finished her letter and became conscious that she had written first and last and at great length about her own affairs, without once mentioning Lois's. Her face grew hot, and she thought, "This is what Miss Greene was always warning us against, egoism." She hoped our Order of the Cup would overcome it. "Well, I must write a postscript and answer Lois's letter. I'll rewrite this last page. No, I haven't time. Lois will understand. Postscriptum. I am reading the different editors' requirements for stories, for I shall soon begin a story, and they all ask for human interest. How I wish you were here, darling Lois." The next morning Betty drove into the village to post her letter and to do her shopping. She was going along slowly, for she always saved the fat, spoiled pony. She was bareheaded, light hair curling in the moist atmosphere and sticking out in little curls from the heavy braid, skin browning fast and cheeks glowing to a delightful berry color, eyes dark and happy, seeing everything, as if they were meant for use and not for beauty alone, as older people were apt to think when they looked into their clear depths. Straight, proud nose held daintily aloft, as if its owner were displeased, which was not the case, for Betty took things pretty much as they came, mouth curving to a smile, yet trembling sweetly too, in sympathy with the possibilities of life's sorrows, so very far off on this perfect June day. Such was Betty Baird outwardly as she went gaily along. "Oh, Clamor boy," she called, and drew rein as a tall lad, sunburned to the color of fine bronze, came out of a trim garden, carrying a pair of oars and a fat cushion. He wore knickerbockers and a Norfolk jacket with the sleeves cut off at the shoulders. Something in his well-knit frame and the slant of the oars over his shoulder carried out still further the resemblance to a masterly piece of bronze. He hurried up to the pony, dropping the cushion to jerk off his red cap. "You can't guess what came yesterday," said Betty at once. The Clamor boy shook his head. "Do try to guess," insisted Betty. "I can't think what comes to girls. Now to boys, I never guess anyway," he concluded desperately. Betty sighed and gazed on him pityingly. "What a lot of fun you must miss. I have guessed since I was 2 years old." "Girls are different," said the Clamor boy comfortably. "Oh, boys can do some things. Clam, for instance," said Betty condescendingly. "But what came?" demanded the boy. "Why, a check." Betty prolonged the suspense before speaking out the great word. "Gee, you don't mean it!" he cried, his eyes shining, and dropping his oars and taking the check which Betty held out to him. "For literature!" he ejaculated reverently. Betty nodded. The Clamor boy whistled softly, his custom when greatly pleased. "Well, you have begun it," he said slowly. "I think clamming brings more money," said Betty politely, when she saw that he had been properly impressed. "Clamming!" snorted the boy scornfully. "Now don't you dare say a word against clamming," warned Betty, "for I'm dying to go into the business. Indeed, I don't see why I couldn't," she added briskly. "It wouldn't do at all for a girl," exclaimed the Clamor boy emphatically. He looked at his own torn and blackened nails, and then at the girl's dainty white hands. "I'm no more afraid of browning my lily white hand than you are," Betty protested. "But it's not the work for a lady," he insisted. "Ladies never have clammed," he added convincingly. Betty's chin went up in the air. "Neither did they go to college in the dark ages." The Clamor boy was miserable. Betty looked very determined, and his stock of argument seemed futile before her learning. Betty was quick to follow up her advantage. "Yes, and women were not allowed control of their own property until Susan Anthony or someone proved their rights. Why, even when Mother was a girl, school teaching was the only thing a girl could do to earn her own living, and they had wretched pay. They had to be poor relations. Think of it!" Betty's eyes flashed. unless they had parents to support them or an income of some kind. Women can't vote." "You wouldn't vote," broke in the boy indignantly. Betty waved his exclamation aside. By this time she was so warmed to her subject that she almost forgot her original intention, which was solely to tease the very serious Clamor boy. Then, seeing his distressed countenance, she flecked her pony with the whip and stopped short. Something quaintly chivalrous shone in the lad's face as he stood there, a silent protest against any lowering of his ideal of woman's place and woman's work in the world. His frank hazel eyes did not waver while he gravely listened to her arguments, though his natural slowness increased when brought into contrast with her ready repartee. "Well, I might prefer being a lily of the field to a Clamor girl, but I am anxious to make some money for a definite purpose, and I will turn into a vegetable garden or a lily bed if I can make money." "Or into a clam," continued Betty, with a flash of merriment in her eyes, but with a grave manner. She wondered if he would hoot at the idea of such a talkative girl turning into a clam. But no, he was too much in earnest to turn the conversation into a joke. "There are some things for girls to do and some for boys," he reiterated doggedly. "Clamming for boys at $12 a barrel and dishwashing for girls at— virtue is its own reward when it's to save old Katie's rheumatic back," scorned Betty. "I'd better go clamming and pension Katie outright and hire a girl to wash dishes." "Clamming is no work for ladies," persisted the boy. "Well, if ladies can't clam, can they make money out of a vegetable garden? Father says you have a fine one, and I have about decided to combine trucking with literature." "Yes, that would be the thing. I'll come over some day soon, at high tide, and tell you all about it and show you how you should begin. Mine has paid." "Oh, dear," cried Betty ruefully, "I have kept you from your clamming, and time and tide wait for no man, or boy either. In your case especially, there is a tide in the affairs of men that taken—no, not at the flood, but at the ebb—leads on to fortune. Please forgive me." "There's plenty of time," answered the Clamor boy, looking over the bay. "There goes Cap Simpson, the best clamor out." Betty's eyes followed the sturdy figure of the boy they had nicknamed Cap. The sky was of undimmed blue and the bay unruffled as a looking glass. The young Clamor's scow rested on its blue surface. A light wind swept across the water, bringing to the shore a refreshing taste of saltiness. "How good life is! How good!" cried Betty. She turned from the sky and water to the silent boy. "It certainly ought to make clamming a poem." She seemed as she spoke to hold life in the palm of her pretty hand, flashing it like a jewel in the sunlight. "It's different out there," said the boy literally. Betty laughed and gently slapped Merrylegs with the reins, starting him into his slow jog, while the Clamor boy picked up his oars and pillow, ran down to his scow, and pushed off. "Bring your Latin grammar over when you come to talk vegetables," called Betty after him. The lad waved his red cap. As she drove along, Betty grew thoughtful, and the pony, taking advantage of her brown study, stopped, resting comfortably under a willow tree that had gathered beneath its mighty branches deep restful shadows that a fat little pony knew how to appreciate on a summer afternoon. Stooping over a small basket in front of her, Betty took out a serviceable looking commonplace book and wrote for several minutes. "Note: start a vegetable garden. Price seeds at Smith's." She sat up straight and gazed over the shore and water, then bent down again, writing swiftly. The shore in the sunlight glittered like a great jeweled girdle. Belt dropped carelessly, and the little cove nestled cozily in one of its many folds. She looked critically at the shore as she ended her sentence. "Yes, that's true," she murmured, tapping the book with her pencil. "It is not far-fetched." Cheek by jowl with this was a recipe for caper sauce. Make a drawn butter sauce and add 2 or 3 tablespoonfuls of French capers. remove from fire, and add a little lemon juice, followed by, she keeps the gift of years before a withered violet in her bliss. Then came a recipe for Vassar fudge, with these for its nearest neighbors. Ah, did you once see Shelley plain? And did he stop and speak to you? And did you speak to him again? How strange it seems, and new. Meats for June: mutton, beef, lamb, veal. End of chapter 4. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 5 of Betty Baird's Ventures by Anna Hamlin Weikel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 5. Lois Bird's Coming. "Mother, mother, here is a letter from Lois!" cried Betty joyously, bursting into her father's study and waving a dainty envelope aloft in triumph. "Lois is coming, coming! I can hardly believe it." "Why, I thought Lois was going to Capri with her father," said Mrs. Baird, looking for more information, but Betty was bending over the long letter, completely absorbed. "Listen to this," she cried. "Father is going to make a long journey to the East, Egypt and other places, with a party of friends. His doctor thinks it will help him. Oh, that it would! And he is now writing to your mother to ask if I may stay with you. Such an if! As if we aren't simply wild to have her, aren't we, mother, father?" Dr. Baird, glancing up from his paper, smiled amusedly at the idea of there being any question about having Lois, Betty's dearest friend. "I shall be delighted to have Lois," Mrs. Baird answered her. "I love her, and I know how happy you two are together." "Won't we three girls, Carissima, have a lovely time out here?" said Betty, kissing her mother rapturously and giving her a delighted bear hug. "Your mother looks as young as either of you," said Dr. Baird. "Indeed she does," agreed Betty decisively, for she always refused to see the gray hairs that were sprinkling the beautiful brown, and insisted they were only short faded ones. Gray? No, indeed. Mrs. Baird, looking pleased but laughing away their flattery, asked Betty to read more of the letter. "You know how funny father is, Betty. When I read him your letter, he said I should tell you that Capri was a very ancient, not up to the minute place, wholly lacking the modernizing and ennobling influence of My Mother's Cookery Journal, but that he would introduce the journal as soon as you had captured its pages, for then he would be sure of its having the right kind of modernity. Isn't Mr. Bird ironical? It is perfectly fascinating." Betty laughed happily over Mr. Bird's pleasantry, while continuing to read, "It is too good to be true that we are to be together all summer, perhaps longer. I take your darling mother's consent for granted, for did she not adopt me in Weston? I wanted to take you by surprise, and begged father not to write. I know how you love surprises, but father thought it a rather bold plan. I know that I have a home always and in all circumstances with you, darling old Betty Baird. Now, mother, I must run right upstairs and see about arranging her room." "She will have the room next to mine?" asked Betty. "I must hurry and make it pretty." Betty started towards the door, with her eyes traveling over the pages of the letter. "Do sit down and finish your letter, Betty," said her mother. "You haven't told us yet when Lois is coming." "Oh, I forgot!" exclaimed Betty, shrugging her shoulders, the joke flashing upon her. "Why, not for a week. Isn't that too bad? Not for a whole week." She turned the pages impetuously. "Here it is. Mr. Bird wants us to telegraph so that he can make arrangements immediately." "Then before beginning with Lois's room, have John hitch the pony and take this telegram to the office." Mrs. Baird wrote a cordial welcome to Lois. Betty wrinkled her pretty forehead perplexedly. "Why didn't I think of that myself? All I thought of was to make her room artistic. I must learn to be more businesslike." "I shall write to Mr. Bird at once," said Mrs. Baird, taking up her paper. "A week will give us more time to make her room attractive, Betty, so don't be disappointed." Yes, we have so much to do. Won't Lois love this view of the bay?" said Betty, pointing out of the window to where the dying violets and crimsons of sunset were reflected in dimmer, more mysterious tints in the water. Perhaps her own view of the Potomac is more to her taste," suggested Mrs. Baird. " Oh, I am sure of Lois's tastes. We always like the same things." "And people?" "Yes." Betty hesitated. "I think I like more people and like them harder, for she is fastidious. But when it comes to friends, we are one." "I am glad of that. Now hurry off, for it is almost dinner time." Yes, the week did pass, though Betty consulted her calendar skeptically each day, for time did not seem to pass as the faithful calendar asserted it did in its large red figures and new daily quotations, and the day for Lois's arrival actually came. It was Thursday, and Betty was up with the birds that twittered and chirped and sang away in the fir trees in front of her room. She whistled and sang softly, keeping them company. She put their song to words. "Lois is coming, Lois is coming," each tiny bird sang. Strange how the notes fitted the happy words. Every few minutes, while she was dressing, she peeped into Lois's room. How pretty it was! The Swiss curtains were drawn back, revealing the ever-changing picture of the bay. A fir tree threw waving shadows into the room. Not a pin was out of place. Lois's favorite flowers, sweet peas, were in a bowl on the dressing table, and above the writing desk a little vine trailed over a picture of the pines. How the hours lagged after breakfast! Would train time never come? Oh, if it should rain and Lois miss the beauty of the sunset! And low tide. That summer everybody had come at low tide, and if it were low, Lois would only see the tall green marsh grass, beautiful to be sure in its vivid coloring, and falling before the wind like the long pile of green velvet, but not wonderful like the rising tide rushing through the water gates at the mill they had to pass on their way home. Betty ran for the tide table, though she knew it would be high tide, but she could not sit still. Anything was better than that, even tormenting oneself. "Let us go upstairs for a last peep, mother." Betty flew up the low, broad steps 2 at a time, Mrs. Baird following more leisurely. "It looks like Lois already," said Betty, glancing around the room. "She loves to watch the sunset, and the paper is sweet, with these little rosebuds and tiny fresh leaves tumbling over the white ground. Lois is so dainty. I am glad the paper and paint are fresh." "Yes, and there is a splendid southerly breeze through that window," said Mrs. Baird, adjusting the already perfect curtains. "It is as charming as I thought it before I knew Lois was to have it, and that's a test. I become critical when things become concrete. That's not the word, but you understand." Merrylegs was decked in all his splendor of new yellow harness with shining brass points, and the yellow cart was dusted and polished until it shone. Merrylegs held his proud head high. Betty, with a cluster of roses in her belt and her head bare, looked radiant. She had to wait half an hour for the train. Then, breathless and with eager, watchful eyes, she scanned each traveler in the crowd pouring out on the platforms. "There she is! There she is!" she exclaimed, and waved her hand frantically when Lois stepped out of the jostling throng and looked about her expectantly. Seeing the pony cart, she hurried forward. Betty jumped down, and into each other's arms they flew. "Oh, I am happy!" sighed Betty blissfully. They seated themselves in the cart, and she tapped Merrylegs lightly with her whip. "It is so good to see you again, Betty. You haven't changed at all," said Lois, though it might have puzzled one to say what change could have taken place in the few weeks since they graduated. "You look taller, Lois. Perhaps it is that beautiful hat. It's awfully good to have you." Betty squeezed Lois's hands, and Merrylegs trotted gaily on at his own sweet will. Lois was not so tall as Betty, nor did she possess her beauty, nor that magnetism which drew everyone until it grew to be a joke among her friends that if a stranger wanted to ask for a street she waited until she could ask Betty. Lois was very affectionate, maidenly, and withal something of a tease. She had serious brown eyes, arching eyebrows, dark hair tastefully arranged. Indeed, a look of well-being, of having been delicately nurtured, was in every graceful movement, as well as in the fine skin and figure and the courteous glance. Her gowns bore in every line the unmistakable mark of Paris, and even a casual look was sufficient to note that she had traveled extensively and that money had been lavished wisely upon her. It was near sunset when they reached home, and the tide was high. "How beautiful! You didn't tell me half," exclaimed Lois rapturously. "Oh, I am so glad you are not disappointed, Lois. I have been trying to see the place with your eyes all the week," answered Betty. Mrs. Baird, hearing the cart approach, came out onto the porch. "There is your mother. Oh, Mrs. Baird, I am so glad to be here," Lois cried, and sprang down from the cart straight into Mrs. Baird's outstretched arms. The three girls went up to Lois's room. The sun, sinking behind the hills, threw crimson rays of welcome through the small paned windows. Lois clasped her hands as she stood at the door, gazing at the sunset. "I have always longed for a room where I could see the sun set behind the hills." "It is coming home, dear," said Mrs. Baird, putting her arms around the girl. "Now let me take off this hat and veil so that I can see your pretty face better." The next day Betty rushed to her mother. "Mother, isn't this perfectly grand? Mrs. Ellsworth has to go to a funeral and can't take Dottie with her, and she asked me if I would take care of her tonight and tomorrow," she cried when she returned with Lois after taking her father to the station. "It never rains but it pours. I have Lois, and now here comes Dottie." Mrs. Baird's face was full of concern. "I trust Mrs. Ellsworth is not in trouble," she said. To her, a funeral did not present the same aspect it did to Betty, judging from the latter's blithe words and manner. "I don't think it is any one dear, you know. I am afraid I didn't ask, but she wasn't crying, and Craig laughed as usual, which isn't much. Besides, if it were any one near, he wouldn't be going clamming in his overalls." Betty's logic was not wholly convincing to her mother, who hardly expected the poor lad to wear mourning when out clamming. "I must go over and see about it, Betty. Have the cart ready for your father's train if I am detained, and explain the circumstances. He has had a hard day, so make him very comfortable. I'll run upstairs and see that his study is in order, the lamps trimmed and bright, and the fly — there never is more than one in your rooms — out. I'll give his easy chair a twist towards the sunset and his slippers a twist towards the chair, place his thin coat on the back of the chair, and have his letters in a row on the table, and Daddy will be all comfy in a minute." Mrs. Baird was putting on her bonnet, and Betty stood by, smoothing out her gloves and seeing that the dainty bow under the chin was at the proper angle. She gave the bow several farewell pats, then stepped back for inspection. "You'll do," she announced. Her mother, laughing, drew on her gloves and gave a look into the study. "I dislike to be away when your father comes home, but I can't leave Mrs. Ellsworth alone if she needs help. Your father will have a good substitute for me." Betty rode her mother to the Ellsworth home, then came swiftly back, for train time was approaching. A few hours later, Mrs. Baird came home, in her arms the 3-year-old Dot of Betty's heart, a grave brownie of a child, with the dignity of an Indian idol and the sweetness and loveliness and charm of a Donatello cherub. End of Chapter 5. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 6 of Betty Baird's Ventures by Anna Hamlin Weikel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 6. Pickles. Pickles, murmured Betty ecstatically, clasping her hands and gazing up at the ceiling. Pickles. Dot looked up gravely from the floor, where she was lost in the rapture of clothes that come off and on, belonging to Betty's flaxen hair doll, whose height almost equaled Dot's own diminutive inches. Dot was a model listener. She was also the most dignified and mannered personage in the village. Pickles, of course. Oh, Dot, why didn't you suggest long ere this, when you must have seen me searching every cranny of my brain for a means of earning a livelihood? Why, oh, why didn't you whisper, pickles, delicious pickles, cucumber pickles, Betty's best brand pickles? It would have been the part of a friend, Dottie. Betty shook her head reproachfully at the tiny listener, whose big brown eyes gazed up into hers, her dimpled chin and her baby hand. " Oh, Dottie Dotteral, no disrespect meant, for you are a bird, but not a dullard," continued Betty. The little face quivered, then, with a toss of her curls, the wee bit of humanity jumped up from her lowly seat and stood, all defiance, before Betty. Her dignity was offended. Such facetiousness was unwarranted liberty. Betty snapped cajoling fingers at her, trying to restore pleasant relations, but it had gone too far. Dot set up a dignified wail and buried her curly head in Betty's lap, refusing to look up or to have her grief assuaged by the most artful coaxing. Betty had scolded her. Dottie Waddy, cunningest darling," cried Betty, trying to lift the rigid little figure to her feet. Let Betty see your pretty eyes." The child raised her head, but held her tiny fingers over her face. Through the curving bars peeped her great round eyes. Where is Dottie Waddy? " asked Betty, looking round everywhere but at the small figure standing erect and still and dominating, with the solemn eyes watching Betty's every motion. Where's Dottie Waddy? " cried Betty anxiously, getting up from her chair and peering into corners, lifting books, peeping into closets. The brown eyes behind the plump little fingers gazed unwinkingly. " Oh, Dottie Waddy is carried off by bad fairies and has left her Betty all alone," lamented Betty loudly, and wiped her eyes desperately. Here I is, cried Dottie, while 2 wee hands flew to the handkerchief and 10 chubby fingers dabbed into Betty's face to wipe away the tears. Here I is, Betty. Don't oo see Dottie? And she clambered hastily into Betty's lap, hugging her close and repentantly kissing her sweet cheeks. Why, Dottie Waddy! " exclaimed Betty in great surprise, opening her eyes wide, to Dot's huge delight. " Where did you come from? Did the good fairies bring you back to Betty? " Dot's face grew sunny as she snuggled her warm, soft little body closer in Betty's arms. " Bad fairies took Dottie. Good fairies brung Dottie back," she whispered happily. Good fairies," cried Betty. " Let us thank them. I have a notion that they like to be thanked something like this, for it would n't do just to say, ' Thank you, ma'am,' to fairies." Trying her hand at improvising, Betty began to sing to the good fairies. Oh, fairies good, oh, fairies good, to bring Dottie Waddy back in a hood of spun gold, o'er the wild gray wold, tasseled and strung, with ribbons rung from the bright rainbow, hung low, so low. As Betty crooned softly, the sun, glinting through the bowed shutters of the open window, haloed her fair hair, tousled in play with Dottie. The serious brown eyes were looking into hers, when, glancing upward, they fell on the radiant sunshiny locks. " Oh, Betty, oo look likee pitty lady ith the hoops wound her head." The child pointed eagerly to a colored picture of a medieval saint with a halo. Betty looked at the picture and turned laughing to Dottie. Now we certainly are friends again, little personage, after that delicate compliment," she said, kissing the curly head and dimpled red cheek. Dottie nodded solemn assent and slid down to the floor with the giantess doll. May I now consult your Highness about pickles? " asked Betty meekly. She had learned her lesson. Queen Dot must be treated with a fine reserve and the utmost consideration. Pickles? What's pickles? Dot stopped in the act of taking off for the 10th time a pair of slippers that adorned the doll's feet. A pickle? Let me consult the standard. Betty looked into the great volume sedately, though smiles twinkled deep in her eyes. One of certain objects preserved or flavored in pickle, as a cucumber or an onion. Now we, Dot, will stick to cucumbers. Dottie smiled and nodded tolerantly. She loved Betty, but had to keep on her dignity with her. She was too free a lance for the self-contained child. What do you say, Dottie Wottie, to making a dozen bottles of cucumber pickles? A whole dozen, 2 more than you have fingers, Betty said, and counted them off on the child's chubby hands. Dottie smiled broadly at the counting, then, without answering, proceeded to undress the flaxen Queen of Hearts. Betty meditated a moment. Why not 2 dozen while we are at it? Can you give a fair and unprejudiced opinion on the subject? The Women's Exchange must be hungering and thirsting for pickles. I am sure of it. Then why not 2 dozen? Never will I be limited. Signs of the bad fairies returning caused Betty to smile and kiss her hand with an assumed airy unconcern to the small autocrat. No, Dottie, not 25, but 50 jars. No, 100 jars. I'll be the greatest pickle preserver in the world, a Pierpont Morgan on the Pickle Exchange. Dottie actually laughed aloud at that, and Betty, feeling flattered, ran on. Think, Dottie, of 100 jars of pickles, those tiny little cucumber pickles that Katie makes up. We have the cucumbers in our own garden. Katie planted so many of them that everyone laughed. It ought really to be Katie's pickles. Katie's pickle pocket pennies. Can you say that real fast? Pickle pocket pennies. Yes, Katie's money instead of mine. But I'll do the preserving. Well, I am always poaching on Katie's preserves. That's a pun, Dottie. 100 bottles at 40 cents each. Betty snatched up a piece of paper and began figuring rapidly. She always dealt in even numbers, for she confessed she was weak in multiplication. It's done. $40, less the cost of jars, vinegar, and other small items. Let us find out on how many occasions pickles are used. Betty ran for her cookbook and read with many gesticulations. Pickles are very popular. List. Popular. As a relish, but it must be confessed that they are not the most wholesome diet. Ours will be. This is chiefly due to the fact that they are made of hard, crude, and often unripe fruit. Our pickles will be made of soft, cultivated, ripe fruit, and a fit diet for invalids. Dot was highly amused. What makes oo do dat? The pretty tot of a prig asked, as Betty's arms swung in dramatic action. Her mother never did such things. Children are great sticklers for conventions. That's too hard a conundrum. Come, it's time for your afternoon nap. Betty took her up in her arms. Dottie clung to the Queen of Hearts, and Betty held the 2 until both were asleep, the superannuated doll's eyes shut, and Dot cuddled in the curve of the young arm. Betty debated and planned her second venture, literature and pickles. 2 irons in the fire. Lois came in. Hush, Betty warned, with a wave of her hand towards the sleeping child. Lois sat down quietly in the window seat. Lois, Betty whispered, I have had an inspiration. I am going to make pickles for the Women's Exchange. 100 bottles. End of chapter 6. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 7 of Betty Baird's Ventures by Anna Hamlin Weikel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 7. Betty in a Pickle. There! Exclaimed Betty with a grand gesture as she stood off and gazed admiringly at 50 bottles of pickled cucumbers. 50 bottles of Betty's best brand at 35 cents a bottle. Cheap at that. Sorrowfully cheap, but beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. She turned to her audience of fellow admirers standing behind her, her mother, Lois, and, in the background, old shining Katie, chuckling with pride in her young missy, with her ample arms akimbo, her bandana bobbing and gyrating about like a red and yellow buoy in a choppy sea. Katie, continued Betty, there's a fortune, a neat little fortune in that row. Some dense people might call them pickles, but we know pickles spell fortune. Yes, missy, dat they done do. Done do? Dundee marmalade. Oh, blessed Katie, in your simple, guileless language, you have given me another inspiration that will spell fortune. Marmalade. Not Dundee, or as you wittily put it, Dundoo, but English breakfast marmalade. The kind, you know, Lois, that the little English girls always have in the nursery with the poor governess, and when they have smeared it all over their faces and are wiping their naughty sticky fingers on the beautiful governess's only white gown, in steps Uncle John from India, and to be continued in our next. Don't you think, daughter, that it would be well to see how these pickles go before you venture anything else? Asked Mrs. Baird, pleased and smiling, but with a somewhat anxious eye on the long line of jars. You need to get your market first. Mother, catch your hare before you cook it? That's not the business method of today. Those pickles will make their own market. As if any housekeeper, even the dullest, the most sordid, could resist their charms. Why, a sight of them would cure the worst dyspeptic. I am only sorry now that I didn't make 100. Oh, Betty, think of the worry of trying to dispose of 100 bottles, said Lois. 100 sounds so much better. 100. The mere sound is thrilling. 100 bottles of pickles. Such pickles. Especially recommended for midnight feasts at boarding school. You ought to send Miss Leet a sample bottle, laughed Lois. Our grocer, Mr. Beach, said he would take half a dozen on commission. Mrs. Ellsworth wants 4 bottles. I don't like to sell to her, but she insists on buying them. Selling to a friend. Betty looked dubious. Yes, said Mrs. Baird. I don't like it either. I always give a jar of everything I make to my neighbors, just to be neighborly. Why not sell her 2 and give her 2? Suggested Lois. Betty is doing this to make money, and she may give away too many. Besides, Mrs. Baird, it's really doing Mrs. Ellsworth a favor because you can't buy such things. You remember you sent home to Father a box of preserves and jellies when I visited you in Weston, and Father said he would give anything if he could buy such delicacies. That is very kind of your father, Mrs. Baird answered, quite embarrassed. During this conversation, Betty had been lifting the whole 50 bottles, one by one, and smiling in perfect delight as she examined the small symmetrical cucumbers. I didn't know pickles were so lovely, she mused. Positively fascinating. Such a delicious green. Lois dragged her away, and together they ran upstairs, where, after making the beds and dusting, they sat down to do a little figuring on the cost. This had been an almost daily process since the day Betty first thought of pickles. Lois sat down at the desk and, taking up a pencil and paper and assuming a very businesslike expression, began the real work, bookkeeping. You certainly must have a book, Betty, and put down, what was it Miss Spice taught us about accounts? Credit and debit? I am not sure what she called them, but they meant what you pay out and what you get in. Out and in would do as well. No, we must be businesslike. I am sure it is credit, but the debit doesn't sound right. Yes, and there was deficit, but let's not have that, for it means what you lose, and we won't lose. No, indeed, cried Lois, almost paling at the horrid idea. Look, I have found this dear little book, cried Betty, handing Lois a square book bound in marble boards. Lois puckered up her charming lips and wrote credit on several pages in a neat, painstaking hand, and debit on as many more. I know it's not debit, Betty, she said, puzzled. I can tell as soon as I see a word written down whether it is correct or not." "Then why not be original? We know what it means. Under debit we will put down all we sell. Under credit, all it costs, bottles, vinegar, commissions, and so forth." "And gifts?" "Yes," said Betty, irresolutely. "Perhaps, but it does look cold-blooded to put down the cost of a present." "Yes, it does," Lois answered. "Let's call them by another name." "Of course. Good idea. Now how would untasted sweets — no, that's horrid. I know. Friendship's Offerings, shortened to F.O. How much will the bottles and vinegar cost, Bet?" "Here is a piece of paper on which I was trying to figure out the cost of each jar," Betty answered, and the two heads bent over the slip while she explained the maze of figures to Lois. "The cucumbers were in your garden and cost nothing," Lois said at last. "I think you ought to clear on your quart jars. Well, you ought to make—" Lois worked away on the piece of paper a few minutes, while Betty sat in the window seat and watched her in suspense. "You ought to clear—" Lois stopped again and scrutinized her figures. "Yes, 27 cents on each jar." "27 cents!" "Perhaps it might be 27½ but fractions are hard." "Yes, and sevens are too. Well, let's just say 25 to be sure, and then there will be no risk. That's $12.50, $1 more than Craig is making on his clams, and it didn't take nearly so long," cried Betty in triumph. "They are not sold yet," Lois cautioned her. "They are as good as sold," said Betty confidently. "Now let us read this splendid new book about automobiles." The grocer sold 7 bottles of the pickles. Betty gave Mrs. Ellsworth 4, steadfastly refusing to accept pay for them, and Miss Hunt 2, and the Women's Exchange took 12 bottles, but said they couldn't possibly sell any more. 2 weeks later Betty stood before the array on the pantry shelf. "25 bottles!" she murmured. "25 bottles of the best pickles ever put up for an unappreciative world's palate." She heard her mother coming in, and without turning she waved her hand towards the shelf. "They make quite a display, don't they, mother? There are pickles and pickles, and we have them." She laughed, but there was a suspicious tremor in her voice, and she carefully kept her face turned from her mother as she hurried out to the veranda, whistling "Bob White, Bob White" to keep up her courage. Mrs. Baird followed her and put her arm around her waist. "It's all right, Carissima," said Betty, and she squeezed her mother in her young arms and tried to laugh. "You don't think I am such a poor business woman as to cry over a first — well, not failure, but not exactly a boom in pickles, was it? Anyway, there's always literature, sure, and if people don't care for sours, I can turn to sweets. It will be like a soft answer turning away wrath, or heaping coals of fire, to give the world preserves after it has scorned my pickles. Such pickles, too!" "A smile is better than a frown," said her mother, taking up her conceit and smiling. Betty laughed and kissed her mother. Then, with a swing full of energy and still whistling, she ran down to the gate. "I am going to walk down the shore and see my Bob White," she called back over her shoulder. She ran until she came to a great fir tree that she and Lois had selected for their favorite seat. It seemed very tall and very straight, but with curving branches, the most sympathetically curved in the world of trees, boughs that bent earthward and then swept towards the blue sky as if they would take up the girl and swing her into the mood of the robins that tilted on the delicate twigs. Betty dropped down on the soft moss under the fir. The whistle ceased suddenly, and a sob took its place. She scarcely noticed the pleasant little brown figure of Bob White. Her eyes could see only the long line of pickle jars. "I have tried, and I have only made $1.25 in literature, and now I have cleared only $1.85 on my pickles." She burst out crying. Bob White started and fluttered away. The fir tree sighed, and poor Betty cried on. The tide came flowing in, and with it came the fleet of clamors, their work interrupted by the rising water. Craig Ellsworth sculled close to the shore near where Betty sat. "Hello!" he cried, putting down his oar and forming a megaphone with his hands. "Hello, Betty!" Betty heard, but she would not turn her head. No, she would not look at the successful boy with his boatload of clams, while her pickles— A big sob stuck in her throat, and she rubbed her eyes energetically with the back of her hand. She was too proud to have him see her cry over her failure. "Hello there, Betty! Are you deaf?" Craig called again. Betty kept her head turned away. In a second Craig had pushed his boat to the shore and leaped out on the dry rocks. "What's the matter, Betty? Are you sick?" he asked solicitously, drawing near her. "Oh, it's you, Craig," she said, turning a suspiciously bright pair of eyes towards the lad. "Had a good day?" she asked, with attempted nonchalance. "Bully. Got over a bushel." "That's good." Betty's voice showed an unusual lack of enthusiasm. Craig looked at her searchingly. "What's up, Betty? Or down? In the dumps?" "What do you mean?" asked Betty defiantly, with an "I dare you to see that I cried" look in her red-rimmed eyes. "Oh, nothing," said the boy with elaborate indifference. In some things he was wise beyond his years. Besides, he looked up to Betty as one who had, to use his own expression, brains to burn, and he could not always treat her with the offhand manner he used towards other girls of her age. To Craig Ellsworth, born with a reverence for academic learning, Betty's 3 years at boarding school and her remarkable knowledge of Latin put her quite above the common run of girls. "Why," he had told his father with amazement, "Betty Baird can take up Horace and read off one of those poems as if it were English." Even the superiority of being a boy could not wholly offset this profound and fascinating attainment. Now he was silent, with kind though awkward pretense, looking everywhere but at poor miserable Betty. "I just hate people who pretend," burst out Betty, with the quick injustice of one who considers herself a failure in the presence of one who has succeeded, and she whirled around and began walking rapidly towards the house. Craig stood rooted to the spot. Why, what had happened to Betty Baird? Betty, who was always, in his eyes, as free from vapors and cranks as the best boy. What had he done to her? He gazed after her for a second, then walked slowly towards his clamming scow, the unwitting fly in the ointment of Betty's success, or rather lack of success. Betty turned and saw the dejected droop of the lad's head, and with characteristically quick compunction she ran swiftly back. "Forgive me, Clamor boy. I was horrid. I know you were trying to be kind when you pretended not to see that I was crying. I was crying. I was almost screaming when you came up. There." The Clamor boy was visibly embarrassed. He was not at home with emotions, especially girlish ones. Not being able to think of a remark suited to the occasion, he plunged his hand into his trousers pocket, drew out his knife, and began to scalp the bark off the tree. "Don't hurt my tree," objected Betty, snatching the knife from him and shutting the blade with a snap. The lad was immensely relieved. They were once more on familiar grounds. He tried to take the knife from Betty, and in the tussle their normal and recognizable relations were restored. After all, he thought, there was no nonsense about Betty Baird. She wasn't a crybaby, and she didn't confuse a fellow by mysterious erratic ways. When the struggle ceased, Craig had the knife, and Betty was sitting breathless on the ground. "Clamor boy," presently said Betty, solemnly, and her voice took on a deeper note. "I am a failure." "Oh, no, no," he protested. "Yes, a failure. I have 25 jars of pickles left on my hands." Tragedy could go no further. The Clamor boy understood now the meaning of those red eyes and quivering lips. He knew what it would mean to him to have his clams left on his hands. "Jiminy!" was all he could say, but Betty felt comforted and brightened at once. "I am not discouraged," she assured him. "I am going in for preserves now." "Bully for you! You have grit." "I was mad," said Betty. "I was mad because you had clams and I had — pickles. Only you could sell your clams, while I had overstocked on pickles." "I couldn't help that. Why were you mad at me? I didn't do anything to keep your pickles from selling," answered the boy, with a boy's logic. "Oh, well, you would understand if you were a girl, but a boy — boys can't understand anything unless it's printed right out in front of their eyes. Here comes Lois." Evidently Mrs. Baird and she had been talking over the predicament, for her look was very sympathetic. Throwing her arm around Betty's shoulder, she gave her little caressing pats. Betty shook her head, and Lois understood that she meant she could not stand being pitied. "Let's all make fudge," Lois proposed. "It's cool enough with this north wind. Anyway, we can make it in my chafing dish." "Let's!" agreed Betty. "Bully!" Craig chimed in. The three dashed towards the house. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 8 of Betty Baird's Ventures by Anna Hamlin Weikel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 8. A New Scheme and a Dory Race. "Why don't you start a garden?" asked the Clamor boy. "A garden so late in the summer? Who ever heard of such a thing? But I do want to plan one for next year," answered Betty, with the assurance of a girl who had seen John, their farmer, do the early planting of a vegetable garden on shares. "Lots of people. I, for one," replied the Clamor boy calmly. "I'm doing a great deal of planting just now, and I will help you if you want me to." "I'd love to have a dear little garden with peas and corn, and potatoes and red tomatoes too. But really, isn't it too late?" "No, not for fall vegetables. I'm beginning to plant purple top turnips today. I had cabbages there this spring, and I expect to have the turnips ready for the table by the middle of August. After that, I shall plant winter beets." "My, what a lot you know!" exclaimed Betty flatteringly. "How in the world did you learn all that? I certainly must begin at once. It's so interesting. Where shall I begin?" she asked, starting off towards the garden that had been cultivated on the lines of old garden lore for several generations. "I take a magazine that tells me when and how to do everything. I'll lend it to you. John can do the hard work, and you can plan and watch and make money." "I do." "Make money!" Those words threw a spell over poor Betty, who had grown weary looking into the little glass window of their letter box in the post office, and at the array of pickles on the pantry shelf. "Oh, mother," she cried, almost running into Mrs. Baird and Lois in her eagerness to get to the vegetable garden, "we have such a good plan. I'm going to make heaps and heaps of money, and I won't have to wait until the pears are ripe enough to preserve either. I am going to start a garden." "The very thing!" exclaimed Lois. "I'll help. I'll make a grand digger, I am sure." "But isn't it rather late?" Mrs. Baird asked with interest. "Not at all. Craig is planting purple top — isn't that a pretty name? — purple top turnips now." "We don't care much for turnips," suggested Mrs. Baird doubtfully. "I love turnips, especially raw ones," Lois declared. "I'll buy them from Betty, Mrs. Baird, and sell them to our grocer," said Craig, with the air of an established commission merchant. "And Betty can sow sweet corn and early Valentine beans," he added learnedly. "And I can sow cabbages," said Betty. "And winter carrots," said Craig. "And cucumbers," said Betty. "And eclipse beets," said Craig. "And reap money," finished Betty triumphantly. "How mercenary my little girl is growing," laughed Mrs. Baird. Well, Betty defended herself, one of those political economy men in a lecture at the Pines said that when we received money for our work we had one big proof that we are efficient. Bet you will be on the platform yet, teased Lois. What else can we plant, Craig? Betty asked, now full of fervor at the thought of making a start in life, even if it were through the vegetable garden. You can plant winter celery on the land from which you harvest your early corn. From which you harvest your early corn, quoted Lois banteringly. That sounds very much like your garden magazine, Craig, and Betty, you know, hasn't any early corn. You're right, Craig said, laughing good-naturedly. I read the magazine over so often that I suppose I do often string 'em out in the very words. That is the only way to learn anything, answered Lois. Harvest, repeated Betty, with a smile of poetic joy, and not heeding the friendly little tilt between Lois and Craig. I didn't have any idea such pretty words were used in huckstering. Certainly huckstering is not a very romantic name, said Mrs. Baird. As you say, Betty, planting and sowing and reaping and harvesting are poetical. I don't see why one can't use pretty words as well as ugly ones when they are appropriate, without people thinking you are affected. I love to say plaisance instead of backyard. I think we must all yield individual taste in small matters now and then, for it is a duty to be agreeable, as long as it is consistent with one's conscience, said Mrs. Baird, taking Betty's hand and stroking it lovingly to take away any preachiness in her words. Now, Mother, said Betty, laughing, you know there is no danger of my becoming eccentric. Father said last night that young people were fond of experimenting. I must go now and get ready for our dory race, said Craig suddenly, starting towards the gate. It begins at 3:00. Aren't you and Betty and Lois coming? He asked Mrs. Baird. Of course we'll come, cried Betty and Lois in a breath, while Mrs. Baird said, I shall be pleased to come. Shall we wear your colors? I shall have a red jib, said Craig. Good. We'll know him by the cut of his jib, cried Betty. We'll have red ribbons in some conspicuous place. But your life-saver is to sail in the race, said Craig. Betty clasped her hands dramatically. Ingratitude, that marble-hearted fiend, shall never dwell in this heart. I retract. I show no favors, not even for purple-top turnips and early Valentine beans. Well, he didn't save your mother's life, nor Lois's, and I'll look for some red ribbons anyhow, said Craig. 3:00 found Betty rowing her mother and Lois to the yacht clubhouse, where they could sit on the veranda and watch the races. Betty was rowing in fine style. She was very fetching in her blue sailor suit, while her hair flew and blew radiantly in the brisk southerly breeze that was filling the spotless sails of the dories. 7 dories were entered for the race. Look, cried Betty, leaning over the balcony rail. Don't the sails way off there look exactly like A-tents? Look like a tents, exclaimed Lois. How do they look like a tents? And what tents? Present, past, or future? Goose, responded Betty. Present tense, of course. Aren't they present out there? And aren't we tense with excitement here? But don't you really know what an A-tent is? No, I don't, confessed Lois, much to my present and intense sorrow and humiliation. Now, wise one, tell me what it is. An A-tent, Miss Baird, I would have you remember, is a tent whose front, and back too, is triangular, like an A, and that is precisely what those leg of mutton sails out there look like. What vast learning, mocked Lois, and bubbling over with fun, the girls watched eagerly for the start. Swiftly came the dories, tearing through the water before the freshening wind, as the starting gun sounded. The red jib is leading, cried Betty, stretching forward excitedly to see, then quickly drawing back as she found herself obstructing the view of a very handsome and distinguished-looking woman of middle age. Please pardon me, said Betty, turning to her. Don't change your position, for I can see perfectly, answered the stranger. She smiled and added, "I am watching my son's boat." "That makes it more fascinating," said Betty, blushing as the older woman gazed into her face with evident interest. "Do you know, I believe I have heard of you. My son knows you," said the lady, smiling brightly. Betty looked puzzled. "I'd love to know him," she said, smiling too, yet somewhat at a loss for an answer. Then she colored when she realized what she had said. She felt that this lovely woman's son would be well worth knowing, but that she had been too intense in her expression for conventionality. "Yes, you know my son," said the lady, smiling kindly into the sweet face. "May I ask his name?" Betty was at length driven to say. "He's called Jack by nearly every one, Jack Brooks." Betty shook her head negatively, while she looked down at the water as if some recollection might be borne up to her out of its blue depths. It seemed positively rude not to remember him. Mrs. Brooks saw her predicament and hastened to relieve her. "You may not have heard his name. I shall be more circumstantial. You have a pony cart and a frolicsome pony. Now do you remember?" "Remember!" cried Betty mirthfully. "Now my mother will have an opportunity to thank you. She thinks I was not sufficiently grateful and perhaps acted a little tomboyish." Both turned to Mrs. Baird, and Betty had barely time to name her mother and Lois before some one cried, "They are rounding the stake boat." Mrs. Brooks and Betty leaned forward in time to see Jack's dory come about in fine style and a few yards ahead of the others, the red jib of the Clammerboy a close second. In spite of her declaration of neutrality, Betty had come with the intention of waving a red ribbon for her favorite, but now, with Mrs. Brooks so near, she hesitated to display partisanship. "Whose boat is that with the red jib?" asked Mrs. Brooks. "Craig Ellsworth's. He is a boy of 18, a neighbor of ours," answered Betty. "Then you must feel especially interested in him," Mrs. Brooks said. "I did." Betty stopped short in her explanation. "Until you found I had a special interest," finished Mrs. Brooks, nodding appreciatively. "That is kind of you, but it adds zest to a race for the spectators to be divided. So keep to the red jib, and I shall wave my Harvard colors for my son." The dories ran close to the clubhouse, and Betty saw Jack look up to the balcony as his mother waved her cheering little flag. Then his eyes met Betty's, and she fancied she saw a look of disappointment come across his handsome face when his eyes fell on the flaming red ribbon, the color of Craig's jib, which was hanging from her hand over the railing. The Clammerboy was close at hand and looking up. He too saw Betty, and before tacking, waited a second to swing his cap in acknowledgment of the red ribbon, which she was waving vigorously. Both boats had waited too long. The third dory, the one with the black hull, tacked briskly and sped away in the lead, with triumph written in every line of the triangular sail. "Oh," moaned Betty, "I made them lose. They looked up here and Craig waved his cap, and Mr. Brooks was so surprised to see us talking that he hesitated. Oh, dear!" "Don't be worried, child," said Mrs. Brooks. "They are making up for the lost time." Mrs. Brooks was right. Slowly but surely the two dories overhauled the black hull, and when the second round began they were drawing away from it, with Jack's boat still leading by a few lengths. On the last leg of the course, however, Craig's superior seamanship was in evidence. For years he had made that harbor his playground. He knew every point where the tide was a hindrance, where a help, exactly how close he dared cut the point which they must round without grounding his centerboard, where the breezes were freshest and where they were most likely to be reduced by the trees ashore. This last leg was a beat against a breeze that was constantly stiffening, and in the handling of his boat that day, in tacking at the proper time, and in running her almost into the wind's eye, he won praises from the old sailormen who watched the race with that air of superiority which they always assumed towards these amateur affairs. When his dory crossed the finish line, with 3 good lengths of clear water showing between her and Jack's boat, he was received with hearty hand clapping from the balcony, and even more hearty cheers from the throng of small boys who lined the shores, and who were especially delighted to see one of their own number beat the big bugs, as they expressed it. But none congratulated him more heartily and more sincerely than Jack Brooks, who caused him to blush furiously by wringing his hand and congratulating him on his fine seamanship, then insisting on presenting him to his mother. In honor of his victory, Betty gave him the red ribbon she had been waving, and he declared that he never would use anything but a red jib thereafter. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Holly Jensen.